I am not really into superheroes or comic books in general. I know a little bit about the stories and the characters, but I don't actively follow them. At most, I watch some of the Marvel superhero movies and enjoy them for what they are. That said, I do have a favorite superhero, and that's Spider-Man. I love Spider-Man. Not just as a hero, but he's also just a really great character. So it's no surprise that I love this new Spider-Man game as well. My ears perked up when they first announced this game. Making a video game that really nails the feel of being Spider-Man is a tall order, but Insomniac gets it just right in Marvel's Spider-Man. I'll start with what everyone's minds immediately go to when talking about a Spider-Man game. How's the swinging? Is it better than Spider-Man 2? Yes, it's great. It's one of the most polished, fluid, exhilarating world traversal systems I've experienced in a video game in recent memory. It feels like a lot to get a grip on during the initial tutorial when you first boot up the game, but I found it very easy to wrap my head around after the first mission or so. Transitioning between swinging, wall running, jumping off roofs, and web zipping all feels incredibly smooth. The swinging mechanics are all mapped to the triggers, bumpers, and the X button, depending if you're swinging from buildings, zipping forward for momentum, or zooming onto a perch. Once you're in the flow of it, it just feels like a natural extension of your hands to the controller, almost in the same way that it might feel like a natural extension for real-life Spidey. There's a great sense of speed and momentum to all of it. The swinging feels fully featured right up front, and you unlock more traversal skills in the skill tree to make it feel even better. The only thing that breaks the flow of swinging for me is the unlockable trick system. It's fun and silly and nets you some extra experience points that can add up nicely, but I often found it to interrupt my momentum if I held a trick for a hair too long. But besides those few extra points of XP, it's fairly inconsequential, and I eventually just stopped doing tricks altogether unless I was just goofing around in the open world. Which leads me to the next big question. How's the open world? Does it actually feel like New York? The answer is also yeah, pretty much. Anyone who knows me by now also knows that I spend a lot of time in New York. I love that city. It's not where I live, but it feels like my second home. It's also not often I get a chance to explore a video game recreation of a city and experience that sense of familiarity. I live in Miami, so there aren't many video games set here. And I also haven't seen a video game set in New York recently that I wanted to play. Until Spider-Man came around. It's not a one-to-one recreation of New York, of course. It's largely condensed and has some landmark changes and new additions, but the general feel of the city is still there. One of my favorite things to do in that game was simply going around the city, visiting landmarks, and doing things I have actually done while I was in New York. I sat in Bryant Park across what would be the Kinokuniya. I took a relaxing walk down the High Line. I looked for Joe's Pizza on Broadway. It wasn't there. I even went to the top of the game's equivalent of One World Trade Center and enjoyed the view, just on the outside this time. Luckily, the game also encourages some of this exploration through its side activities. There's a mission type that asks Peter to break out his photography skills and get shots of major real-world and in-universe landmarks. The Empire State Building, Avengers Tower, Madison Square Garden. MSG in particular gave me a special kind of joy because it's one of my favorite buildings in the city. And if you still need more photo shenanigans after you've completed all the landmark activities, there's the wonderful photo mode to fill that need for you. There are plenty of other mission types littered around the city as well. Activating towers to reveal the map, stopping petty crimes, taking out enemy outposts, world traversal challenges, and even pigeon chasing. Turn a corner and you're bound to find something to do. It's almost Ubisoft-like in how many side activities there are, the difference being I actually had fun doing the majority of them. The challenge missions were my least favorite type of activity. Thankfully, completing them at any rank counts towards the district completion percentage. You only have to worry about getting higher scores if you plan to get all the unlockables. And even then, you can get by with a lot of rank 2s and only a handful of rank 3s. I guess my major gripe with the side activities is the pace at which new types of them are doled out. I see the reasoning. There's a large variety, so the game feeds them to you at a slow pace as to not overwhelm you right from the get-go. But I think that pace is just a bit too slow. This is especially true with the full-on side missions. Different from side activities, these are unique little side stories of Spidey helping out some folks with their problems. There just aren't that many of them. Because of that, there were long stretches of the game where I had none of those specific side missions on the map because I hadn't hit a point where the game would sprinkle out the next batch of them. I would have much preferred more side missions at the cost of less side activities. All in all, the side stuff does a great job at keeping me engaged with the world, and when I didn't want to interact with any of it, it was still plenty of fun swinging district to district and finding points of interest. Spider-Man's version of New York feels like New York, aesthetically at least. Some of the city's personality isn't quite there, but the game makes up for that because it has personality to spare in other parts. You can't have a Spider-Man game without nailing Spider-Man's persona. I'm happy to say that Yuri, All I Hear Is Yosuke Lowenthal did a good job in doing so. He's no Tom Holland, but then again, no one is. Love you, Tom. In Marvel's Spider-Man, Peter Parker is older, a bit more mature. He's been fighting crime as Spidey for a while now, but he's still that goofy nerd we know and love. Spidey has quips for days. There are so many of them. Not quite enough that you won't hear repeats often, but still enough that it isn't annoying in ways that other chatty protagonists can get. There's even an unlockable ability whose sole purpose is to quip at enemies.
No bug jokes, okay? Spiders are arachnids!
Of course, Spider-Man's personality isn't everything. There are more characters in this game. There's Mary Jane, who at this point has broken up with Peter. You can definitely feel a bit of awkwardness between them in their interactions. Yuri Watanabe, Spidey's cop contact, who just barely deals with his antics. And you can't forget about J. Jonah Jameson, who in this world has been ousted from the Daily Bugle and now has his own podcast where he just yells about Spider-Man conspiracy theories all day.
Emulate Spider-Man in any way, and you will die! Don't do it, kids! And that's another one of Uncle Jonah's life lessons. Jared, trademark that.
Even things in the periphery are dripping with personality. The fake Twitter feed in the menu, the chibi Spider-Man emotes, the fast travel subway scenes, the bits of info on the backpack collectibles, and all the cool suits Spidey can wear. You can even walk around the street and high-five or shoot finger guns at people. All this really helps push that sense of enjoyment and almost pureness that I would want out of a Spider-Man game. So we got the swinging down, the open world covered, and all of Spidey's character traits. What else does Spider-Man do? He punches bad guys. Let's talk about combat. If you've played an Arkham game, the combat will seem a bit familiar at first blush. I do think saying that is a little reductive though, because of all the unique things only Spider-Man can do with his webs. The combat can be broken down to 3 buttons: square to attack, circle to dodge, and right bumper to use your various types of web gadgets. Sounds simple enough, right? It is, at first. Throw a few punches, dodge when the Spidey sense buzzes around your head, throw some more punches, and a few webs for good measure. It's not until the game starts throwing more and tougher enemies at you that things start to get a bit hairy. You're gonna need to get pretty good at balancing tons of dudes and perfect dodging real fast. I would say that the combat has a low barrier to entry, but a high skill ceiling. Of course, as you level up, you get more skills to make fights easier. Triangle becomes a web zip that can also disarm enemies. Your Spidey sense gives a better indication of when to execute a perfect dodge, and you can unlock more gadgets and perks to pull off crazy tricks. In fact, let's talk about those for a minute. You have 3 types of interchangeable abilities at your disposal for combat: gadgets, perks, and suit powers. Gadgets include your basic web shooter, stun webs, web grenades, and even an anti-gravity field. Perks are passive abilities that you can equip and change out at any given time. You can have up to 3 perks equipped in total. Suit powers are essentially your supers. Each suit you unlock comes with its own power, but they aren't tied to the suit. So you can mix and match your power with your aesthetic choices, which was a big deal to me. Going back to my personality point, seeing all of Spider-Man's different suits is part of that. Having the freedom to pick any suit without being locked into a specific suit power was vital. By the end of the game, I did have a favorite combination of skills to use when in a fight, but I never did feel like it was the be-all end-all loadout. I still enjoyed engaging with most of the other gadgets in different situations, many times switching on the fly in the middle of a large combat scenario. Guy with a rocket launcher, impact web him to a wall. Group of enemies, shock blast, web bomb, and suspension field one right after another. You can also go through certain combat scenarios with a focus on stealth, picking off enemies one by one, stringing them up on flagpoles and streetlights. This approach is incredibly satisfying, and I always try to go about it this way at first when given the chance. Like many other parts of the game, the combat feels very polished and fluid. I spent about 36-ish hours playing Spider-Man, and I even went back and fought some more dudes after the fact post-game. I didn't really get tired of it. Mostly. Boss fights in particular can get a bit repetitive since they just amount to hitting a guy a bunch of times and doing a few quick time events. There's a few set piece interactions that are different with every boss, and those are cool, but the damage dealing sections are basically the same all the way through. While I'm on boss fights, a lot of them are put in the final act of the game. I expected them to be a bit more spread out. In fact, Spider-Man as a whole is pretty backloaded. The first 2 acts are much slower paced, and I don't mean that negatively. The game is just very deliberate with its story pacing. A lot of time is spent getting to know Peter, his current life situation, and the people close to him. There are even segments where you play as people other than Peter. It's a neat idea on paper, but in practice, there were some of the weakest segments of the game. All you're doing is sneaking around an area trying not to get caught because it's an instant fail state. They aren't particularly challenging, the checkpointing is very generous. It's just kind of an inconvenience in a game full of so much enjoyment otherwise. The 3rd act ramps everything up significantly. More spectacle, more excitement, more classic Spider-Man villains you expect to see. It really pushes the story forward and made me want to see it through. The stakes are raised, relationships are tested, and Peter has to be a proper crisis-averting superhero now. Unfortunately, that comes at the expense of something that's core to the enjoyment of the game: swinging around the open world. I won't get into heavy spoilers, but the story events in Act 3 lead to circumstances where enemies show up all over the map. I couldn't go 2 blocks without getting shot at or having to dodge some rockets. You're not forced to stop what you're doing to deal with these enemies, but it makes traversing New York and doing any side activities more of a chore than it should be. This is probably to push you towards finishing the story, which I get, it is a good story, but it felt like it was hampering some of my freedom. The story does end on a satisfying note. The final boss fight, while very mechanically similar to the other boss fights, still conveys a sense of tension and heavy consequence thanks to the character work. There's some great acting in the final sequence that does a fantastic job in selling the emotional burden that being Spider-Man has on Peter. Overall, the story is something you can absolutely see fitting right into the kinds of stories the Marvel Cinematic Universe tells. Great action, fun moments of levity, and serious dramatic shifts. It goes beyond what you might expect from games based on comic book characters in the past. It's not just something tacked on hoping you'll enjoy the game mechanics enough to not care. It's something you'll be invested in. It even does the legwork to set up for a sequel. They don't just blow the doors wide open, they leave open the windows, the vents, the pet doors. They might as well just blow the entire roof off the goddamn house. Now, I'm not one to ask for direct sequels pretty often, but a direct sequel to Spider-Man is definitely something I want. In fact, I think it's worth looking into a whole Marvel games universe after this. Marvel Spider-Man doesn't reinvent open world games. It's an open world game that is refined and focused on making the player really feel like they're the web-slinger. It's some of the most fun I've had with a video game in 2018. It's one of only 2 games this year that I've 100%ed, and one of only 3 games that I have ever platinumed. Even after all of that, I still want to go back and play some more. There just literally isn't more for me to do. I think that shows exactly where I stand on this game. What else is there to say? I love Spider-Man. It's as simple as that.